Stand in the National Museum of Denmark today, and you can see a wool tunic preserved in peat for 11 centuries, its weave still intact. More than 4 million people visit Scandinavia annually to trace Viking heritage, yet most imagine horned helmets and bear pelts that never existed. But rewind 1,000 years, and you would have found merchants in silk from Byzantium, farmers in linen dyed with madder root, and warriors whose cloaks were fastened with silver brooches worth a year's grain harvest. Wealth, status, identity, survival. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction, we are about to walk you through every era of Norse dress, from the first woolen cloaks of the migration period to the Christianized fashions you can see in museum collections today. The story begins not in the Viking Age proper, but in the centuries before the first longship touched English sand. Between 400 and 550 CE, Scandinavia was a cold frontier at the edge of the collapsing Roman world. The Germanic tribes who would become the Norse wore simple tunics of undyed wool, spun on drop spindles by women who controlled the entire textile economy. Sheep were wealth. A family's flock determined whether children wore scratchy wool or the finer thread reserved for trade. Men wore knee-length tunics belted at the waist, with wool trousers bound by leg wrappings called winningers. Strips of cloth wound from ankle to knee to keep out snow and marsh water. Women wore long linen undergarments beneath woolen overdresses suspended by paired brooches at the shoulders. These brooches were not mere decoration. They were the largest investment most families ever made. Passed from mother to daughter, their bronze or iron surfaces hammered with spiral patterns that linked the wearer to ancestors buried a century before. Color was rare. Madder root produced dull reds. Woad gave weak blues. Saffron, imported at staggering cost from the Mediterranean, created yellows reserved for chieftains. Most people wore the natural grays and browns of unwashed fleece, but even in this austere world, clothing carried meaning. A man's belt buckle announced his tribe. A woman's brooches told her lineage. Fashion was not vanity. It was survival encoded in thread. Between 550 and 790, the Vendel period saw Scandinavia emerge from Rome's shadow into something new. Ship burials at Vendel and Valsgårda in Sweden reveal a warrior aristocracy obsessed with display. The dead were interred in clinker-built boats with their weapons, their horses, and their finest clothing. Wool cloaks lined with fur, leather belts studded with bronze, and the first evidence of silk reaching the north. This silk came from Byzantium and Persia along trade routes controlled by the Khazars and the Rus. A single silk ribbon might be cut into decorative bands and sewn onto the hem of a wool dress, a visible marker that this family had connections beyond the fjord. Women's costume became more elaborate. The paired brooches grew larger, some weighing half a pound of gilt bronze, their surfaces writhing with interlaced animal motifs, serpents biting their own tails, boars with bristling backs, hawks clutching fish. Between the brooches hung chains of glass beads, bronze wire, and amulets, tiny hammers, whetstones, keys, each one a statement about the wearer's role. A key meant she controlled the household stores, a whetstone meant she could sharpen her husband's blade. Fashion was becoming a language. Men began to differentiate themselves not just by weapons, but by the quality of their cloth. A jarl's retinue wore matching cloaks dyed with costly weld, creating a uniform yellow that announced their lord's wealth before a word was spoken. Leg wrappings gave way to fitted trousers, still wool but now tailored to the leg and tucked into leather boots with iron hobnails. Belts became toolkits, hung with knives, fire strikers, whetstones, and purses of silver hack metal. A man's belt was a portable treasury. And at the throat, cloaks were fastened with penannular brooches, open-ringed pins that could be removed quickly in a fight. Even beauty was tactical. Then, in 793, Norsemen sacked Lindisfarne, and Europe learned to fear the north. The Viking Age, 793 to roughly 1050, was the zenith of Norse material culture. And nowhere is this more visible than in costume. The raids brought wealth flooding back to Scandinavia. Arab silver, Frankish swords, Irish gold, English wool, Byzantine silk. A farmer's daughter in Birka might wear a linen shift imported from Frisia beneath a wool overdress dyed with kermes, an insect-based red so vivid it seemed to glow. Her brooches were no longer simple bronze castings, but masterworks of silver filigree, some weighing as much as a sword, their surfaces inlaid with gold and niello. Between them hung 15 strands of glass beads, amber from the Baltic, carnelian from India, blue glass from the Rhineland. Each bead a node in a trade network that stretched from Greenland to Baghdad. Men's fashion exploded in variety. Warriors returning from the west wore Frankish-style tunics with embroidered hems, their wool so fine it draped like linen. Traders dressed in layers, linen undertunic, wool overtunic, a cloak of felted wool that could double as a blanket, and a fur-lined hood called a hutta that kept out the North Atlantic wind. Colors became status markers. A man in a saffron yellow cloak had either raided a monastery or traded a boatload of furs. A woman in a red dress dyed with kermes was wealthy enough to buy dye worth more than gold by weight. But the greatest revolution was in accessories. Brooches became statements of allegiance. The tortoise brooches worn by women in Denmark differed from those in Norway, which differed again from Swedish styles, regional identities made visible. Men wore arm rings of twisted silver, often gifted by a lord after a successful raid, and these rings were not just wealth, but bonds of loyalty. A warrior who broke his oath returned the ring. A warrior who died in service was buried with it, the silver following him to Valhalla. Even hairstyles carried meaning. Free women wore their hair long and bound in intricate knots. Enslaved women, thralls, had their hair cropped short, a visible mark of status that could be read across a crowded market. Beards were groomed with combs carved from antler, often decorated with runes or animal motifs. Appearance was not vanity, it was identity in cloth and metal. By the mid-9th century, the Norse were no longer raiders on the periphery, but settlers, traders, and rulers embedded in the fabric of Europe. Dublin, York, Rouen, Kiev, each became a crucible where Norse fashion absorbed and transformed. In the Danelaw, the Norse-controlled territories of England, Scandinavian women wore Anglo-Saxon brooches alongside traditional Norse styles, creating hybrid costumes that announced a new identity. Neither fully English nor fully Norse, but something forged in conquest. In Russ's territories along the Volga, Swedish traders adopted Slavic trousers and Persian kaftans. Their wool cloaks fastened with silver brooches stamped with Arabic inscriptions from melted-down dirhams. Fashion became a passport. A trader in Hedeby might dress Norse in the morning and Frankish in the afternoon, changing costume as he moved between the Scandinavian quarter and the Frisian docks. Women's costume grew more complex as trade goods diversified. Silk stopped being a rare treasure and became a standard accent. Silk ribbons woven into wool headbands, silk tablet-woven trim on linen sleeves, even entire silk overdresses for the wealthiest jarls' wives. These silk garments, found in graves at Birka and Hedeby, were often sewn in Constantinople, shipped to the Volga, traded to a Swedish merchant, and worn by a woman who had never seen the Bosphorus, but whose wardrobe connected her to an empire 1,000 miles away. Jewelry became wildly eclectic. A single woman's grave at Birka contained Irish penannular brooches, Frankish finger rings, Byzantine coin pendants, and traditional Norse tortoise brooches. Her body a museum of the Viking world's reach. Men experimented with length. Tunics grew longer, hemlines dropping to mid-calf in imitation of Frankish and Byzantine styles. The short, practical tunic of the Vendel warrior gave way to something more like a robe, its hem often embroidered with geometric patterns in silk thread. Even trousers changed. Some men adopted baggy Eastern styles, while others clung to fitted Norse cuts. Fashion was no longer unified. It was a negotiation between tradition and the relentless pull of the wider world. The 11th century brought the cross and the end of the old ways. Norway's conversion under Olaf Tryggvason began in 995. Denmark followed under Harald Bluetooth. Sweden resisted until the 12th century, but the result was the same. The pagan symbols that had adorned brooches and belts were melted down or buried, replaced by Christian iconography. Thor's hammers became crosses. Valkyrie amulets became saint medallions. Fashion changed to match the new faith. Women's paired brooches, pagan symbols of continuity and ancestral bonds, fell out of use, replaced by single-disc brooches stamped with crosses or images of the Virgin. The elaborate bead chains disappeared. Christian modesty demanded simplicity, and the old display of wealth became suspect, a reminder of the heathen past the church sought to erase. Men's costume shifted toward European norms. The long tunic became universal, its hem often reaching the ankle, its wool dyed in the somber blues and greens favored by Frankish lords. Cloaks were fastened with ring brooches in the Irish style, and the old penannular pins, too closely tied to pagan grave goods, were abandoned. Belts lost their toolkits. A Christian man carried a purse and a knife, not the arsenal of amulets and fire strikers his grandfather had worn. But change was not total. In rural Sweden and Norway, women continued to weave wool on warp-weighted looms unchanged since the migration period. Farmers still wore leg wrappings. Fishermen still wrapped themselves in felted cloaks that stank of lanolin and salt. The conversion happened in the halls and churches, not the fields. And even as the Norse became Scandinavian Christians, their clothing retained traces of the old identity: wool from their own sheep, brooches passed down through generations, colors drawn from the same roots and lichens their ancestors had used. The past could be buried, but it could not be unwoven. By 1100, the Viking Age was over, but its influence lingered in the costume of medieval Scandinavia. The Scandinavian kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, were now fully integrated into Christian Europe, their fashions increasingly indistinguishable from those of France or England. Women wore fitted gowns with long sleeves, their waists cinched by woven belts, their heads covered by linen wimples in the style mandated by the church. The old overdress and brooches ensemble survived only in conservative rural areas, a folk costume that marked the wearer as old-fashioned. Men adopted the long tunic and hose of the European knight, their wool sourced from English and Flemish weavers rather than local flocks. The fur-lined cloak remained. Scandinavia was still cold, but it was fastened with a simple clasp, not the elaborate penannular brooches of the past. Color became more uniform as guild regulations standardized dye practices. The wild regional variations of the Viking Age gave way to a narrower palette: blues from woad, reds from madder, blacks from oak galls. Saffron and kermes remained costly, but they were no longer the status markers they had been. A wealthy merchant in Bergen dressed much like a wealthy merchant in Bruges. Yet archaeology reveals continuity beneath the surface. Graves from 12th century Sweden still contain wool woven on traditional looms, leg wrappings in the old style, and the occasional tortoise brooch buried with a grandmother who refused to give up the old ways. Fashion had changed, but memory lingered in every thread. The Norse had become Scandinavians, Christians, Europeans, but the wool still smelled like sheep, and the sea was still cold. Stand in Oslo's Viking Ship Museum today, and you can see fragments of the past preserved in oak and earth. Scraps of wool, corroded brooches, the ghostly outline of a cloak that once kept a queen warm on her journey to the next world. Tourists photograph the Oseberg ship, its carved prow still fierce after 1200 years, but few notice the textile fragments in the glass cases nearby. A woman's overdress, its tablet-woven trim still faintly red, its wool still smelling of lanolin and thyme. That dress connects us to a world where fashion was not frivolous but essential. A language of identity spoken in thread and dye, a currency of status counted in silver brooches and silk ribbons, a map of the known world worn on the body. The Vikings conquered with swords, but they defined themselves with cloth. From the undyed wool of the migration period to the silk-trimmed gowns of the Christianized North, Norse fashion evolved as the culture itself evolved, absorbing, adapting, surviving. The ships are gone. The halls are ruins. The gods are myths. But the wool remains, and the brooches, and the memory of a people who dressed not to impress the world, but to claim their place in it. A culture that refused to be forgotten.